I woke up to find my own beach house overrun by strangers. My own family had taken it over for their reunion. I couldn't believe it. Every memory, every plan, every ounce of trust gone. That's when I made a choice. They weren't leaving, unless I made them pay. The moment I arrived at my beach house, I felt my chest tighten. I had been dreaming of this week for months. Just me, the ocean, and the kind of peace only an empty beach house can bring. But the serenity I imagined was gone before I even stepped through the front door. The driveway was full of cars, children running everywhere, and the unmistakable smell of someone else's barbecue smoke lingering in the air. I froze, unsure if I had misremembered the dates. But no, there they were. Trevor Hale, my cousin, with that smug smile that always made me uneasy, was lounging on my deck chair. Beside him were his wife, Linda, and their 3 loud kids, all sprawled across my furniture as if it had been theirs for years. My heart sank. The house that had been in my family for generations, my personal sanctuary, was now a playground for my own relatives, people who had no right to be there. I stepped forward, hoping they would recognize the obvious truth. This was my home. But Trevor waved casually, like I was an intruder, and said, "Morgan, it's just a family reunion. Relax. Make yourself at home." His voice was calm, almost charming, but beneath it was the sharp edge of entitlement. Every word stung. Every laugh they shared felt like a betrayal carved directly into my chest. I had tried to imagine the worst before I arrived, but nothing could prepare me for this. The sense of shock was overwhelming. Every corner of the house held memories of my childhood, of late-night study sessions by the ocean, of birthdays celebrated in quiet joy. Now it was all hijacked. And in that instant, I made a decision that would set the stage for the reckoning to come. If they thought they could just waltz in and take what was mine, they were sorely mistaken. At first, I tried to convince myself it might be a misunderstanding. Maybe Trevor thought I had invited them. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. But as the hours passed, the illusion of family warmth shattered completely. I wandered through the living room, trying to assess the chaos. My antique bookshelf, carefully curated over years, was now a climbing frame for their kids. My dining table, polished for special dinners, was covered in half-eaten sandwiches and spilled juice. Trevor and Linda laughed, passing around plates and telling stories as if I wasn't even there. The casual way they treated my home like it was theirs cut deeper than any insult could. Trevor caught my eye and smiled that condescending smile. "Morgan, why so tense? Just enjoy the sun. Family should be fun," he said. Fun. Fun was clearly only for them. I felt invisible, like my existence had been erased from the very space that had always belonged to me. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just entitlement. This was a deliberate power play. I tried again, speaking calmly. "This is my house. You can't just take over like this." But the words bounced off their self-assured confidence. Linda rolled her eyes and whispered something to Trevor. They didn't care. Every laugh, every careless remark, reinforced the truth. They didn't see me as family, they saw me as an obstacle. And that's when the anger started to simmer. Not the blind, impulsive anger of the moment, but a slow, cold rage. The kind that whispers in your ear. They need to feel what it's like to cross the line. I realized that words alone wouldn't reclaim what was mine. They would need a lesson. A lesson in respect, a lesson in consequences. And I was ready to teach it. Calmly, carefully, and with precision. After hours of watching them lounge, laughing, and acting as if they owned every inch of my beach house, I realized that being polite had failed. The calm reasoning, the gentle reminders, the subtle hints, they meant nothing to Trevor and his family. Their entitlement had no limits, and every passing moment felt like a knife twisting deeper into my trust. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside me. It was time to take a stand. I walked into the living room, where Trevor was mid-story, his children sprawled across the rug, and Linda sipping my finest wine. "Trevor," I said firmly, "this has gone too far. You're in my home. You need to leave." Trevor looked up, his eyes widening just a fraction before his smug grin returned. "Morgan, come on. Don't be dramatic. It's family," he said, waving off my words like a minor inconvenience. That's when I knew words weren't enough. The casual dismissal only strengthened the fire in my chest. I realized I needed to act decisively, but smartly. I wasn't going to yell or storm out. That would give them the upper hand. Instead, I calmly let them see that I was serious, that I was no longer willing to be ignored or disrespected. "I'm serious," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I will not stand by while you treat my house like a hotel. This stops now." Their laughter faltered for a second. It was the first crack in the mask they'd been wearing all day. Trevor opened his mouth, probably to argue, but I cut him off with the weight of my presence alone. For the first time, they noticed that I wasn't just a passive cousin. They were facing someone who had the patience and resolve to enforce boundaries. That moment marked the turning point. I realized that reclaiming my home would require more than confrontation. It would require careful, calculated action. Revenge wouldn't be loud or chaotic. It would be precise, satisfying, and unforgettable. After confronting Trevor and asserting my boundaries, I needed a moment to breathe. I retreated upstairs to my study, trying to process the audacity of what had just happened. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My personal letters, journals, and even old photographs, things I had stored carefully, were scattered across the floor. Some pages were crumpled, others had smudges from little fingers, and my old vacation albums were opened as if someone had been looking for secrets. It wasn't just that they had taken over my house. It was that they had rifled through my life, turning over memories and trust as if they had ownership of them. I picked up a photograph of my grandmother and held it tightly. Trevor's youngest had been scribbling over it with a pen. My heart ached, not just at the damage, but at the realization of how little respect they had for me, my family, and my history. Everything they had touched was tainted with their carelessness. It hit me then. This wasn't an innocent family reunion gone too far. It was deliberate. They wanted to assert control, to prove they could push me aside and act as if my home, my memories, and my life didn't matter. Every laugh they shared in my living room, every insult hidden in a joke, every careless touch of my belongings. It was a silent assault, a declaration of entitlement. The betrayal cut deeper than any argument could. This wasn't about furniture or space. It was about trust, respect, and recognition. They had stripped away both, and the anger inside me transformed into something cold and methodical. I realized revenge wouldn't just be about reclaiming my space. It would be about making them feel the weight of their actions, the sting of crossing someone who had every right to defend what was hers. And for that, I needed a plan. One that was precise, careful, and unavoidable. After discovering the scattered letters and photos, I retreated to the far corner of my study, shutting the door behind me. I sat in the dim light, letting the salty breeze from the ocean outside calm the storm inside me. Anger had been my first reaction. Hot, explosive, but I knew that would only play into Trevor's hands. This had to be done with precision. I pulled out a notebook and began to map everything. Every room they had invaded, every chair they had taken, every corner they had treated like theirs. I wrote down the sequence of events that had led to this takeover, noting moments where I had tried to reason and been dismissed. This wasn't just planning a way to reclaim my house. It was documenting their entitlement, their audacity, every slight and insult, so that my retaliation would be complete and undeniable. I realized revenge couldn't be impulsive. It had to be subtle, psychological, and inescapable. Every move needed to remind them that they had crossed a line, that my home and my boundaries were not negotiable. I thought about small inconveniences that would frustrate them without warning, small ways to make them realize that control had shifted. I also thought about timing. The longer they stayed, the deeper their sense of entitlement would grow. But the longer I waited, the more satisfying the eventual reckoning would be. I wanted them to feel it. The helplessness, the panic, the shock of losing what they thought they could take for granted. By the time night fell, my plan was forming in detail. I knew which doors I would lock, what subtle disruptions I would create, and how I would confront them at the precise moment when their arrogance made them most vulnerable. This was no longer just about reclaiming a house. It was about restoring justice, delivering a lesson in respect, and letting karma run its course. The next morning, I moved quietly through my beach house, observing every detail with a new sense of purpose. Trevor and his family were still sprawled across my deck and living room. laughing and oblivious, completely unaware that the tide was turning. That ignorance was my advantage, and I intended to use it carefully. I started with small, subtle adjustments, nothing they could immediately pin on me. I removed a few keys from their reach, knowing it would frustrate them when they went to leave. I adjusted the locks on a couple of doors, making sure they could get in but not fully out, just enough to sow confusion. The Wi-Fi, something they relied on to keep their kids entertained, I quietly disabled. Each small disruption would plant doubt, tension, and discomfort. As I worked, I smiled quietly to myself. Trevor's smug confidence had blinded him to my resolve. He thought he was in control, but I was quietly orchestrating every move. Every time they complained about minor inconveniences, it would reinforce the reality that entitlement comes with consequences. I also planned the confrontation carefully. I knew shouting or dramatic gestures would ruin the effect. The satisfaction would come from watching their arrogance crumble when they realized, piece by piece, that they had overstepped in ways they couldn't undo. By mid-afternoon, the first signs of frustration appeared. Linda muttered under her breath when the keys went missing again. The kids complained about the broken Wi-Fi. Trevor's confident expression flickered, though he tried to mask it. The first cracks in their facade were forming, and I felt a quiet thrill. This was the moment when I realized revenge doesn't need to be violent or loud. It's the slow, inevitable pressure, the subtle unraveling of entitlement, that leaves the deepest mark. And by the end of the day, they would understand. Invading someone else's trust is never without consequence. As the day wore on, I watched them closely, taking mental notes of their frustrations. Trevor's overconfidence was fading, and I could see the tiny cracks forming in their facade. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The first signs that my plan was working. I didn't confront them directly. Instead, I let their own arrogance turn against them. When the kids complained about the Wi-Fi not working, I casually walked by and said, "Strange, it was fine this morning." Trevor muttered under his breath, his face flushing. He didn't know I had disabled it intentionally, and that doubt was exactly what I wanted. Linda complained about a misplaced grocery bag. I smiled innocently. "Oh, I don't know where it went." The panic in her eyes was delicious. Their carefully orchestrated family reunion was beginning to unravel, and they had no idea why. Every minor inconvenience, every sudden frustration, was a psychological reminder that they were no longer in control. The power shift was intoxicating. I realized revenge wasn't just about locking doors or moving keys. It was about letting them feel the helplessness, the anxiety, and the frustration that comes from being in someone else's house without permission. Their entitlement had made them blind to consequences, and now consequences were quietly closing in around them. By evening, Trevor's confident smirk had almost disappeared. He muttered complaints under his breath, trying to figure out what was happening, but he couldn't pin it on anyone. I, on the other hand, was calm, composed, and fully in control. Every laugh, every sigh of frustration, every subtle argument between them felt like a tiny victory. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat quietly on the deck, watching the chaos I had orchestrated. Revenge wasn't loud or messy, it was slow, precise, and inevitable. And tomorrow, the real reckoning would begin. By the next morning, I could feel the tension thickening in the air. Trevor and his family were exhausted, frustrated, and just beginning to realize that something was very wrong. Their casual confidence had disappeared entirely, replaced by confusion and subtle panic. It was the perfect moment for me to step in, not with anger, but with controlled authority. I walked into the living room, my steps deliberate, my expression calm but firm. Trevor looked up, attempting his usual smug grin, but it faltered when he noticed my composure. The chaos they had caused, the scattered papers, the misplaced keys, the malfunctioning Wi-Fi, was now clearly linked to my presence. And they knew it. "You've been here for too long," I said, my voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. "It's time to leave." Trevor tried to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Linda shot him a worried glance, and even the kids sensed the shift in power. For the first time that week, they realized this was no longer a game. They were in someone else's house, and that someone else was finally reclaiming control. I calmly walked to the door and turned the key, locking it behind me. The sudden realization hit them like a cold wave. They couldn't leave until I allowed it. Confusion turned to frustration, frustration into panic, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing they were experiencing, even briefly, the helplessness they had inflicted on me. I didn't yell, I didn't shout. I didn't need to. Watching their entitlement crumble silently before my eyes was far more effective. Every glance, every muffled complaint, every nervous whisper became a reminder. Boundaries are not negotiable, and crossing them has consequences. In that moment, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. Revenge was not about cruelty. It was about justice, respect, and finally taking back what was mine. And this confrontation was only the beginning. After locking the doors behind them, I didn't rush to gloat or explain myself. I knew the most powerful revenge was psychological, slow, deliberate, and inescapable. Trevor and his family were now trapped in my beach house, the very space they had arrogantly claimed as theirs. The tables had turned, and I intended to make them feel every ounce of entitlement they had shown me. I moved quietly through the rooms, carefully shifting things just enough to disorient them. Luggage was inaccessible in a corner. A few keys disappeared into hidden drawers, and groceries they had casually piled in the kitchen were locked in the pantry. The smallest inconveniences multiplied, creating tension without a single word from me. I watched from the stairs as Trevor paced, muttering under his breath. His confident swagger was gone. Linda's face, usually bright and smiling, had turned pale and tense. Even the kids were beginning to squabble, their confusion amplifying the growing anxiety. Every frustrated sigh, every raised voice, every nervous glance was a direct reflection of the disrespect they had shown me all week. I didn't intervene. I let them stew in their helplessness, letting the weight of their actions settle in. This was more satisfying than any confrontation could be. The slow realization that they had crossed a line, that they were powerless in a home that didn't belong to them, and that their entitlement had finally met its match. As I sat quietly on the deck, watching them unravel, I understood something vital. Revenge isn't about cruelty, it's about justice. It's about making someone recognize the consequences of their actions without ever needing to raise your voice. And at that moment, the psychological pressure was perfect. They were learning, painfully and slowly, exactly what it felt like to violate someone's trust. Tomorrow, I thought the final act would come. The reckoning they had earned was nearly complete. As the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the beach, I sat on my deck, quietly observing the chaos inside my home. Trevor and his family were exhausted, frustrated, and gradually realizing that their arrogance had consequences. The house was silent in some rooms, tense in others, as the weight of their actions finally began to sink in. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, reflecting on the week's events. The betrayal had cut deep, not just because they took my home, but because they disregarded every memory, every personal boundary, every ounce of trust one had placed in them. This wasn't just a hijacking of property. It was a violation of respect, an invasion of the sanctuary I had worked years to create. Yet, amid the anger and hurt, I also felt a strange clarity. I realized that revenge wasn't simply about punishing them, it was about restoring balance. Every frustrated sigh, every nervous glance, every minor panic that unfolded before me was a reminder that boundaries are sacred, and entitlement unchecked is destructive. They were beginning to understand what it felt like to be powerless, and that awareness was its own kind of justice. For a fleeting moment, I felt sorrow for them as well. Families should protect and uplift one another, not trample over trust and respect. But sorrow quickly gave way to resolve. I had done what was necessary, not out of cruelty, but out of principle. Betrayal cannot go unchallenged, and when it does, it demands accountability. I sipped my coffee and smiled quietly. The lesson was unfolding naturally, and I could feel the satisfaction of justice settling like the tide against the shore. Karma, subtle and inevitable, had begun to work its course, and the reckoning was far from over. By the following morning, the tension inside the house had reached its peak. Trevor and his family were visibly worn out, their earlier confidence replaced by frustration, confusion, and even panic. Every minor inconvenience, from misplaced keys to inaccessible groceries, had chipped away at their sense of control. The entitlement that had allowed them to take over my beach house so easily was finally crumbling under the weight of their own arrogance. I remained calm, letting them feel the consequences fully. Trevor attempted to reclaim some semblance of authority, gesturing toward doors that wouldn't unlock, muttering about something weird with the house. Linda tried to soothe the children, but even they sensed that the rules had shifted. Their reunion had become a lesson in humility. Finally, I walked through the house, surveying the chaos I had orchestrated. I approached Trevor, maintaining a steady gaze. "It's time to go," I said, turning the key to fully secure the doors this time. There was no argument, no negotiation left. They had learned that their entitlement had limits. Watching them pack up, hurriedly and muttering complaints under their breath, I felt a profound sense of justice. They had trespassed not just on my property, but on trust, respect, and family boundaries. Karma had arrived quietly but undeniably. Every frustration they experienced, every moment of helplessness, mirrored the pain they had inflicted by hijacking my home. When they finally left, the beach house was silent again, my sanctuary restored. I walked through every room, touching surfaces, taking a deep breath of salty air, and felt a wave of satisfaction and relief. The lesson had been delivered. Boundaries are sacred, betrayal has consequences, and entitlement unchecked always meets resistance. I smiled quietly, knowing the story wouldn't just be a memory. It would be a reminder to all who cross the line that justice is inevitable, measured, and unforgettable. As the sun set over the quiet waves, I sat on the deck, finally alone in my beach house. The week had been exhausting, chaotic, and emotionally draining, but it had also been a powerful lesson, one I would never forget. Betrayal is never just about what's taken. It's about trust, respect, and boundaries. And when those are violated, justice finds its way. Watching Trevor and his family leave, humiliated and frustrated, I realized the truth about revenge. It's not about cruelty or anger. It's about restoring balance, reclaiming dignity, and allowing the natural consequences of someone's actions to unfold. They had crossed a line, and I had made sure they felt the weight of it, not through violence but through calm, calculated action. Karma, subtle and precise, had delivered its lesson. I also reflected on family, trust, and entitlement. Blood doesn't guarantee respect, and familiarity doesn't excuse selfishness. My cousins had assumed they could manipulate and take advantage of me simply because we were related. But boundaries exist for a reason, and standing firm, even in the face of betrayal, is a form of self-respect that cannot be ignored. Most importantly, I learned that revenge, when executed thoughtfully, can be a mirror. It shows people exactly what it feels like to violate trust and disrespect others. Trevor and his family had learned, painfully and vividly, the consequences of their actions. And for me, that sense of restored control, justice, and peace was priceless. As I watched the last car disappear down the driveway, I smiled quietly. Life has a way of balancing the scales. Betrayal hurts, but standing firm with courage and wit turns hurt into empowerment, anger into clarity, and injustice into a lesson that lingers far longer than any harsh word ever could.